It was a typical Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C. The sun shone brightly over the city, and the usual hustle and bustle of life reverberated throughout the streets. But for me, the day took an unexpected turn that would soon unfold into a bizarre and unforgettable incident. As the Attorney General, I was accustomed to handling issues of law, public safety, and community relations. Little did I know that my own neighborhood would become the stage for an absurdity that felt ripped from a sitcom script. I had just settled into my home office with a cup of coffee when I heard a commotion outside. Initially dismissing it as another ordinary neighborhood disturbance, perhaps a delivery gone awry, I returned to reviewing documents related to pending legal cases. However, when the noise escalated into what sounded like shouting and heavy footsteps approaching my front door, my curiosity piqued. As I moved toward the window, I caught sight of two men dressed in ill-fitting police uniforms approaching my home with an air of authority that seemed both misplaced and ridiculous. My mind raced as I tried to understand what was happening. Were they real officers? Was there some sort of misunderstanding? The thought seemed ludicrous since I had spent years navigating complex legal waters. Surely this couldn't be happening to me. When they finally knocked on my door with insistent authority, I opened it, half expecting to see a case of mistaken identity or a prank gone wrong. Instead, I was met with the sight of these so-called officers who proceeded to inform me that they were there on behalf of our Homeowners Association, HOA, to arrest me for violations related to property regulations. The absurdity struck me immediately. These self-proclaimed enforcers had utterly forgotten who they were dealing with. In that surreal moment, as laughter threatened to escape me, I realized just how far removed from reason this situation had become and how important it was to address their little game before it spiraled further out of control. To fully understand how the day had spiraled into chaos, it was essential to recognize the role and dynamics of the Homeowners Association, HOA, in our community. The HOA had been established with the intention of maintaining property values and ensuring a pleasant living environment for all residents. Over the years, however, its authority had transformed into something more akin to a small fiefdom, where power-hungry board members occasionally overstepped their bounds. While many aspects of the HOA were beneficial, like landscaping efforts and community events, there had been tension brewing among residents due to increasingly stringent rules and arbitrary fines. Many felt that certain board members reveled in their authority, enforcing regulations without considering individual circumstances or fostering a sense of community. A few neighbors had even expressed their frustrations during meetings, complaining that the HOA's enforcement actions were inconsistent and often unreasonable. In my role as Attorney General, I had witnessed similar issues across various communities in D.C., where HOAs sometimes operated without checks and balances. Residents often feared retaliation if they voiced dissent, some even went so far as to avoid confrontations altogether for fear of inciting punitive measures against them. This situation fed into a culture where overzealous enforcement could easily run rampant. As I sat there processing the absurdity outside my door, I couldn't help but wonder whether these fake cops were acting under misguided orders from an overly ambitious HOA board member eager to flex their muscles. It was clear that the two individuals before me weren't just misinformed, they were likely pawns in a game played by someone seeking to exert control inappropriately. This incident was more than a mere misunderstanding. It exemplified how unchecked authority could lead ordinary citizens, myself included, into absurd confrontations. As I prepared to confront these intruders, I realized this moment could shine a light on a deeper issue: the balance between community governance and individual rights within our city. The morning had started like any other in my life as the Attorney General. I woke up early, greeted by the familiar sounds of the city, honking cars, distant chatter, and the occasional siren echoing through the streets. After a quick breakfast, I settled into my home office, surrounded by piles of documents awaiting my attention. The work was demanding but fulfilling, and I often found solace in the routine that came with my responsibilities. As I reviewed legal briefs and prepared for upcoming hearings, I felt an unusual sense of tranquility. It was a stark contrast to the high-octane world of law enforcement and legal battles that typically defined my weekdays. I savored my coffee while imagining the day ahead: meetings with colleagues, perhaps some time to draft new policies aimed at improving community relations within our neighborhoods. Yet, as I immersed myself in a particularly complex case involving public safety regulations, that sense of normalcy was abruptly shattered by a commotion outside. At first, I brushed it off as typical neighborhood noise. Maybe it was just a delivery truck or kids playing. But when the shouting grew louder and more insistent, my curiosity turned to concern. Peeking through my window, I was taken aback to see two men in ridiculous police uniforms strutting toward my front door with an exaggerated sense of authority. Their demeanor struck me as comically misplaced against the backdrop of my otherwise peaceful morning. As they knocked firmly on my door, it became clear that whatever mundane day I had envisioned was about to take a turn for the absurd. As I opened the door to confront this bizarre reality, I couldn't help but think how such a significant disruption could happen on what had started out as an ordinary Tuesday. Little did I know that this encounter would transform not only my day but also illuminate broader issues regarding authority and community governance that were simmering beneath the surface in our neighborhood. As I opened the door, the reality of the situation became fully apparent. The two men stood before me, puffed up with an air of authority, wearing ill-fitting police uniforms that looked more like costumes than actual law enforcement attire. One was tall with a scruffy beard, while the other was shorter and significantly more nervous, glancing around as if expecting backup or some sort of validation for their actions. "Are you the Attorney General?" the taller one barked, his voice attempting to project confidence despite the absurdity of his role. I nodded, fighting back a chuckle at the sheer ridiculousness of what was unfolding. Here I was, greeted not by officers of the law, but by amateurs playing dress-up in a misguided attempt to enforce HOA rules. They proceeded to announce that they were there to serve me with a citation for alleged violations regarding property standards. As they read off a list of supposed infractions, unapproved landscaping changes, a misplaced barbecue grill, I couldn't help but be struck by how trivial their claims were in the grand scheme of things. This wasn't merely an awkward interaction, it felt like an infringement of basic rights. "Excuse me," I interjected with a raised eyebrow, trying to maintain my composure. "You do realize you're impersonating law enforcement, correct?" The nervous one shifted uncomfortably, while the taller one seemed unfazed, determined to press forward. I quickly gathered my thoughts and decided to take command of this surreal moment. "I'd like you both to understand something," I began, tone measured yet firm. "This is not how community governance works. You're trespassing on my rights as a resident. And let's not forget, you're dealing with the Attorney General here." As their eyes widened in disbelief, it became clear that they had underestimated not just my position, but also the gravity of their actions. What started as an absurd prank had turned into a pivotal moment where I could confront not only these imposters but also the broader implications of authority within our community. As I stood there, facing these imposters, the initial shock quickly morphed into a mix of disbelief and amusement. How could anyone think it was acceptable to impersonate police officers in such a blatant manner? A part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, their costumes, their overly serious demeanor, and the ludicrous nature of their claims. Yet, beneath that amusement lay a deep frustration brewing within me. The gravity of the situation began to sink in. These men were not just acting foolishly, they were undermining the very principles of law and order that I had dedicated my career to uphold. I felt a wave of indignation wash over me as I recalled my commitment to protect citizens from abuses of power, regardless of where that power resided, be it in law enforcement or community governance. Their actions represented a dangerous precedent, threatening the trust that residents should have in both their community leaders and law enforcement. "Look," I said, trying to keep my tone measured despite my rising anger. "This isn't just about me. You're playing with something much larger than yourselves." I gestured towards my home office filled with legal texts and case files that spoke to years of work aimed at ensuring justice and accountability in our society. The taller fake cop looked momentarily rattled by my authoritative tone but quickly regained his bravado. The nervous one shifted his weight awkwardly, clearly sensing that this was not going as planned. At that moment, I realized I had an opportunity not only to defend myself but also to challenge their misguided sense of authority. "Let's cut through this nonsense," I continued firmly. "You need to leave my property immediately. You cannot simply decide to enforce rules without due process or real authority." As the tension hung thick between us, it became clear this encounter had transformed from a ridiculous prank into a necessary confrontation about rights and governance, a critical discussion that couldn't be ignored any longer. As the confrontation unfolded, my mind raced through the legal implications of what was happening at my doorstep. Impersonating a law enforcement officer is not only a serious offense but also poses significant risks to public trust and safety. The individuals standing before me were not merely misguided, they were potentially committing crimes that could have far-reaching consequences for themselves and the community. In Washington, D.C., the law is clear regarding impersonation. It carries penalties that could range from fines to imprisonment, depending on the severity of the offense. Yet, beyond the immediate legal ramifications for these two men, there was a larger issue at play: the potential erosion of community trust in both local authorities and governance structures like homeowners associations. I realized that this incident could serve as a crucial case study on the importance of upholding legal standards and ensuring that community organizations operate within their designated authority. HOAs are designed to enhance neighborhood living, but when they overreach, especially through tactics that mimic law enforcement, they not only violate individual rights but also set a dangerous precedent for other communities. My thoughts turn to how this situation might be addressed legally. I envisioned drafting a memo outlining the need for clearer regulations governing HOA enforcement practices, emphasizing accountability measures for board members who abuse their power. This would not only protect residents but also reinforce the principle that authority must be exercised responsibly. With my legal training and experience, I knew I could advocate for reforms that would prevent incidents like this from occurring in the future. As I stood firm before the imposters, it became clear that this encounter was not just about defending my own rights, it was an opportunity to address broader systemic issues that affected countless residents. I resolved to use my position to advocate for the integrity of both law enforcement and community governance, ensuring that no one else would have to face such indignities in their own home. After standing my ground with the imposters, I knew it was time to bring real law enforcement into the situation. My instinct was to ensure that this incident didn't spiral any further and that the individuals attempting to impersonate officers faced appropriate consequences for their actions. With a firm resolve, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, the familiar tone of the ringing line grounding me amidst the absurdity of my morning. When the operator answered, I quickly identified myself as the Attorney General and explained the situation succinctly. I have two individuals at my residence who are illegally impersonating police officers under the guise of enforcing homeowners association rules, I stated, maintaining a calm yet authoritative tone. The operator listened intently as I detailed their claims and how they had approached me. It felt surreal to be in this position, but I understood that involving actual law enforcement was crucial not just for my own protection but also for establishing a clear boundary against such reckless behavior in our community. As I spoke, I could see the two men growing increasingly uncomfortable. Their earlier bravado began to wane as they realized what was unfolding. Within minutes, I heard sirens approaching in the distance. The sound offered a mix of reassurance and urgency. Finally, help was on its way to rectify this bizarre situation. As a squad car pulled up outside my home, two uniformed officers stepped out with an air of professionalism that starkly contrasted with the imposters' antics. As I stepped out to meet them, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. In guiding them toward the imposters, I explained what had happened and emphasized the importance of addressing impersonations seriously. The officers nodded in understanding, ready to take control of what had devolved into an absurd farce. This moment served not only as a return to order but also highlighted how crucial it is for communities to maintain respect for genuine law enforcement authority. As we discussed next steps with real police involvement, it became clear that this unexpected encounter would lead to greater accountability within both law enforcement and community organizations moving forward. In the aftermath of the incident, the Homeowners Association, HOA, found itself in a precarious position. After news of the impersonation incident spread through the neighborhood, residents began to question the legitimacy and authority of their HOA, which had already been struggling with credibility issues. The board members, sensing a public relations crisis brewing, convened an emergency meeting to discuss how to respond. Initially, there was a defensive posture among some board members who attempted to downplay the situation, arguing that the actions of the imposters did not reflect the HOA's policies or practices. However, as more residents voiced their concerns and expressed outrage over what had transpired, it became clear that this was not just a minor blunder but a significant breach of trust. The HOA president eventually issued a statement acknowledging the situation but failed to take full responsibility for it. Instead, he claimed that the two men had acted independently and without authorization, distancing the organization from any implication of wrongdoing. This lackluster response only fueled further discontent among homeowners who felt that accountability was essential in restoring trust. residents began organizing a community meeting to address concerns directly with board members. The mood was tense as homeowners expressed frustration over arbitrary fines and excessive regulations imposed by the HOA. They demanded clearer communication and transparency regarding enforcement actions moving forward. Realizing they were losing control of the narrative, some board members finally proposed implementing new training for volunteers involved in community governance. They suggested enhancing oversight measures to prevent future abuses of authority and emphasized the need for better community engagement. Despite these attempts at damage control, many residents remained skeptical about whether real change would occur. As discussions continued throughout the neighborhood, it became apparent that trust could only be rebuilt through genuine efforts toward accountability and reform, an effort that would require more than just lip service from those in power. The encounter with fake cops had become a catalyst for deeper conversations about governance and accountability within the HOA, underscoring the necessity for organizations like this one to operate transparently and responsibly in order to foster a healthy community dynamic. As news of the bizarre impersonation incident spread, local media outlets quickly picked up the story, intrigued by the absurdity of the situation involving the Attorney General and two imposters masquerading as police officers. Headlines blared across social media and news sites, framing it as a dramatic clash between authority and community governance. Journalists flocked to the scene, eager to capture every detail of this unusual confrontation that had unfolded in a typically quiet neighborhood. Reports detailed how the Attorney General had handled the situation with poise, emphasizing not just the ridiculousness of the imposters but also raising critical questions about the overreach of homeowners associations. Interviews with residents revealed a mix of disbelief and anger, as many expressed their concerns about the HOA's authority and accountability. If they can send fake cops after someone like him, one neighbor stated in an interview, what's stopping them from doing it to anyone else? As coverage continued, experts were invited to weigh in on the legal implications of impersonating law enforcement. Discussions around community governance began to emerge prominently in public discourse, drawing attention to wider issues regarding HOA practices across Washington, D.C. Suddenly, this incident became a focal point for conversations about transparency and ethical conduct within local organizations. Amidst all this media attention, the HOA board members found themselves scrambling to respond not just internally but also publicly. They issued statements attempting to clarify their position but were met with skepticism from both residents and reporters who demanded more than just empty assurances. The Attorney General recognized that this was an opportunity for real change. As public interest grew, so too did pressure on local officials to implement reforms within HOAs. Community meetings began attracting larger crowds, with citizens eager to voice their opinions and engage in discussions about governance practices. What had begun as an absurd encounter at his home had now transformed into a catalyst for broader societal dialogue, one that questioned authority, sought accountability, and advocated for a fairer governance model within neighborhoods throughout Washington, D.C. The media coverage not only illuminated these pressing issues but also highlighted how collective action could lead to meaningful change in community dynamics moving forward. As I reflected on the chaotic events that had transpired, I couldn't shake the profound implications they carried about authority and responsibility. The impersonation incident was not just a farcical encounter, it served as a poignant reminder of how easily power can be misused when checks and balances are insufficient. This situation illustrated a fundamental truth: authority, whether wielded by law enforcement or community organizations like homeowners associations, comes with a heavy moral obligation to act justly, transparently, and respectfully. I considered how far removed the two imposters had been from the tenets of lawful authority. They had not only overstepped their bounds but also endangered themselves and others by usurping roles meant for trained professionals. Their misguided attempt to enforce HOA rules through intimidation revealed a frightening willingness to exploit perceived power. This tiny incident underscored an alarming reality: power left unchecked threatens not just individuals it targets but also the fabric of community trust essential for mutual respect and collaboration. Moreover, I began to think about my own responsibilities, both as Attorney General and as a member of this community. My role encompassed not only enforcing laws but also protecting citizens' rights and advocating for fair governance practices. It was evident that reform was necessary, not just within HOAs but within community structures at large. This incident became a catalyst for action, pushing me to advocate for clear regulations governing homeowners associations and calling for robust accountability measures aimed at preventing abuses of power across Washington, D.C. As I envisioned potential reforms, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. By addressing these glaring issues, we could foster a culture of respect where authority is exercised responsibly and in service to the residents' well-being. Engaging with the community would be paramount moving forward. Workshops and discussions could empower residents to understand their rights while promoting dialogue that reinforces healthy governance practices. The ultimate goal must be creating an environment where authority complements responsibility, aligning the interests of individuals with those entrusted to oversee communal welfare. And in this moment of reflection, I knew the journey ahead would require commitment from everyone involved. As the dust settled from the impersonation incident, it became clear that this was not just a fleeting oddity but a pivotal moment for the community. The Attorney General's resolve led to a series of community meetings, where residents gathered to discuss their experiences with the Homeowners Association and express their frustrations regarding arbitrary regulations and lack of transparency. A palpable energy filled the room as neighbors shared stories, united by a common desire for reform and accountability. Recognizing the power of collective voices, I navigated these discussions with care, emphasizing the importance of establishing guidelines that would prevent future abuses of authority. Workshops were organized, aiming not only to educate residents about their rights but also to foster understanding of how community governance should operate. We invited legal experts and representatives from successful HOAs to share best practices, creating an environment where knowledge was freely exchanged. In the following months, significant changes began taking shape within the HOA. The board agreed to implement regular oversight measures and establish a clearer framework for enforcement actions. They instituted mandatory training for all board members on ethical governance and community engagement practices, ensuring they understood the weight of their responsibilities. The local media continued to cover these developments, shifting the narrative from one of crisis to one of proactive change. Positive stories began to emerge, highlighting how residents were reclaiming their agency and how genuine dialogue was being prioritized over intimidation tactics. As I looked back on the events that had unfolded, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. What began as a chaotic morning had sparked a transformation rooted in resilience and community spirit. This process underscored the critical importance of accountability in governance and served as a reminder that when citizens stand together to demand change, they can reshape their communal landscape. Ultimately, this experience reaffirmed my belief in the interconnectedness of authority and responsibility. In fostering an environment where residents felt empowered to voice their concerns, we not only upheld individual rights but also contributed to a stronger, more equitable community for all. Together, we had transformed an absurd encounter into a catalyst for meaningful reform, proving that even in moments of chaos, there lies the potential for growth and renewal.